She had been planning it for 8 months, not the acquisition that had been in motion for 2 years, moving through the slow, deliberate machinery of commercial real estate transactions with the patience that Simone Achebe had developed over 15 years of buying buildings that other investors had undervalued and turning them into things that lasted. The acquisition had its own timeline and its own logic, and she had followed both. What she had been planning for 8 months was the day. The specific day, the 80th birthday, a Saturday in October, the kind of clear Chicago morning that arrives in autumn as though apologizing for July. She had timed the closing with the quiet cooperation of her attorney and her title company. To fall on that morning, she had asked her mother to bring him downtown. She had told her mother only that she had something to show him, which was true and was also the most precise understatement she had ever offered in 41 years of being her mother's daughter. Her grandfather's name was James Achebe. He had been shining shoes on the sidewalk outside the building at 234 South Wabash Avenue since 1994, the year Simone was 3 years old. He had set up his kit under the green awning on the northeast corner, polished 2 chairs, and built through 30 years of showing up 6 days a week without fail. A clientele of lawyers and traders and architects and city employees who came back not just because he was good at the work, though he was, but because it was the kind of person whose presence on a block made the block feel like a community rather than a corridor. The building behind him for 30 of those years had been a branch of Central Midwest Bank. It had opened in 1988, closed in 2019 when the bank consolidated its downtown locations, and sat vacant for 3 years before going to market. Simone had been watching it for 2 of those 3 years. On a Saturday morning in October, with the closing documents signed and notarized, and in her briefcase, she stood on the sidewalk at 234 South Wabash and waited for her grandfather to arrive. It came around the corner at 9:15, with her mother on his left and her aunt on his right. And they stopped when he saw her standing in front of the building with the expression of a woman who has something to say and has been waiting to say it for a long time. He looked at her. He looked at the building behind her. He looked at her again. He said, "Simone, what did you do?" She said, "Happy birthday, Grandpa." Go back 60 years. James Achebe came to Chicago from rural Mississippi in 1964 at the age of 20, part of the last wave of the Great Migration, carrying everything he owned in a single suitcase and a clarity of purpose that he would maintain for the next 6 decades without visible diminishment. It had come because Chicago was where you came from Mississippi, if you were black and young and had exhausted the available futures and were not willing to stop looking for one. He found work within. A week, not the work he wanted, but work, and he had learned from his father that work was the foundation of everything and that you built on the foundation while you were still laying it. Because waiting until the foundation was finished before you started building meant you never started building. Ed cleaned offices at night and learned the building maintenance trade during the day, working his way into a union shop by 23 and into a supervisory position by 30. He met his wife, Dorothy, at a church social in 1967. They married in 1968 and moved into the apartment on West Garfield, where they would raise 3 children over the following 20 years. He bought a shoeshine kit in 1971 as a side business, not because the union work wasn't enough, but because Dorothy had a dream she had told him about once, quietly, about a small dress shop, and James had decided, without telling her, that he was going to build the savings that would make it real. He polished shoes on Saturdays on State Street for 6 years. Dorothy's shop opened in 1977. It closed in 1993, when she died. And James closed it himself, and had kept the dress form that had stood in the window for 16 years in the corner of his bedroom for the rest of his life. After Dorothy died, he returned to the shoeshine work. Not for money, his pension and the union benefits were enough. He returned because the work was the thing he knew how to do with his hands, when his hands needed something to do. And because being on the street and talking to people and being useful in the specific concrete way of someone who makes a thing better than it was when you found it, this was, for James Achebe, the closest available approximation to peace. He set up on the sidewalk outside 234 South Wabash in 1994 because a friend of his who had worked a corner told him the foot traffic was good and the building management didn't mind. And the neighborhood was the kind of dense, purposeful downtown where people walked fast and needed things that worked, and came back when those things worked. A had been there 6 days a week, ever since. He worked with the specific precision of someone who has done a thing for so long that the doing of it has become indistinguishable from the person. His hands moved the way practiced hands move, without hesitation, without wasted motion, with the efficient grace of expertise that has stopped thinking about itself. It could read the condition of a shoe's leather in 10 seconds and knew before the customer sat down what it needed and how long it would take. He had a conversation for every customer, not the same conversation, but the kind that was specific to them, that picked up where the last one had left off with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention. It remembered birthdays. It remembered promotions. It remembered the names of children who had been born and the names of marriages that had happened, and the particular quality of worry that a person's face held when something was wrong that they weren't ready to talk about yet. And he had learned over 30 years exactly when to ask and exactly when to let the silence do what it needed to do. The people who came to his chairs regularly did not think of themselves as his clients. They thought of themselves as his people. The specific and voluntary designation that arises when someone provides a service so consistently and so well, with such evident care for the person rather than the transaction, that the relationship stops being commercial and becomes something more difficult to name. It watched the building behind him change without being part of the change. The bank opened in 1988 and was for the first 6 years of his time on that corner, the context against which he worked, the sound of the lobby doors, the rhythm of the morning commute in and out, the familiar faces of tellers who came and went over the years and who waved to him through the glass because he had learned their names in the first week and asked about their families the week after. And they had understood, quickly, that he was the kind of person whose interest was genuine. The bank closed in 2019. James set up his chairs in front of the vacant storefront, as though nothing had changed, because nothing about his reason for being there had changed. It was there to do the work, and to be on the street and to be the kind of presence that a block needs in order to be a neighborhood, rather than a thoroughfare. The building behind him was incidental to that purpose, though he had, over 30 years, thought about what was inside it, not with resentment, with the considered attention of a man who has looked at something for a long time and has his own understanding of what it is and what it could be. He had stood on the sidewalk outside a bank for 30 years, and he was not naive about what banks were and what they required and who they served and who they made it difficult to serve. He had sent 3 children to college and built modest savings and managed a household for 5 decades, and had, in that process, encountered the specific friction that certain people encountered with certain institutions more than others encountered it. Ed did not talk about this to many people. Ed had talked about it to Simone once, when she was in her 20s, and had called him from her apartment after a particularly frustrating encounter with a commercial loan officer. Ed had listened to the whole story. Then he had said, and this was the sentence she had carried for 15 years, "Baby, the goal is not to get them to let you in. The goal is to own the door." She had written it down. She had thought about it a great many times since. The building management over 30 years changed twice. The bank branch changed once. The neighborhood changed in ways that were larger than any individual building. The loop's ongoing transformation, the commercial landscape shifting with the economy, the particular character of a downtown Chicago morning, evolving across 3 decades in ways that James noted from his fixed position on the sidewalk. He watched all of it with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who has found his place and intends to keep it. Simone Achebe had grown up hearing about 234 South Wabash, the way children grow up hearing about the fixed geographical points of a family's life, not as a story but as a fact, part of the landscape that existed before memory and would presumably continue after it. Her grandfather's spot, the green awning, the 2 chairs, the building behind him that she had walked past on Sunday visits to downtown with her parents. Her grandfather looking up when she came around the corner with the expression that his face reserved for her specifically, a particular quality of recognition and pleasure that she had been the recipient of her entire life and that she understood, even young, was its own form of love. She had gone into finance not because of any family precedent, but because she had understood, at 17 and then with growing clarity across the following 2 decades, that finance was the language in which ownership was described and transferred. She had grown up watching her grandfather stand on the sidewalk outside a building he had served for years, and she understood, without being able to articulate it until she was older, that the arrangement between the man on the sidewalk and the building behind him was structural. It was the product of decisions made by systems over decades, decisions about who could access what and on what terms. And those decisions had produced a world in which certain people were on the outside of certain buildings, as a matter of course. She had decided, without drama and without particular announcement, that she was going to learn how those systems worked and then use that knowledge to change some of the outcomes. She had started in banking 7 years at a large commercial bank in Chicago, learning from the inside how money moved and how credit was assessed and how the decisions that determined who got resources were made and by whom. She had been good at it and promoted twice and had developed in those 7 years a precise and unsentimental understanding of the limits of working within a system you wanted to change. She moved to commercial real estate investment at 30. She had a talent for the work that her colleagues described as intuitive and that she herself understood as the product of careful attention. She read buildings the way other people read faces, looking for the gap between what something was and what it could be. She founded Achebe Capital at 36. Not large, precise and deliberate, like its founder, focused on identifying properties that the market had priced for their current circumstances rather than their potential. She had in 8 years produced returns that were the envy of considerably larger competitors because she was specific about where she looked and patient about what she waited for. 2034 South Wabash had been on her target list since 2020. She had driven past it on a Saturday morning and seen her grandfather's 2 chairs set up on the sidewalk in front of the vacant storefront, and had held the alignment of those 2 facts in her mind for a long time. It was not sentimentality. She did not, as a rule, make decisions from sentimentality, but she did not believe she was required to pretend the alignment was irrelevant. She ran the numbers over the following year. They were good. She moved on the acquisition in 2022. She had not told her grandfather. She had told her mother 6 months before the closing, because she needed her mother to get James downtown on a specific Saturday morning without telling him why. Her mother had listened to the full explanation, asked 2 questions, and then been quiet for a long time. She had said, "Your grandfather is going to need a moment." Simone had said, "I know." Her mother had said, "And then he's going to need more than a moment." Simone said, "I know that too." She had not told anyone else, because the telling was the part she was saving. The closing had been scheduled by normal commercial real estate standards for a Tuesday. Simone had asked her attorney and her title company if it was possible to move it to a Saturday, a specific Saturday 8 months out that would require a small accommodation on both their parts. Her attorney had looked at her calendar, looked at the date, calculated who would need to be available on a Saturday morning and for what, and said, "For you, yes." The title company had required slightly more convincing. Their weekend availability involved overtime rates for the closing coordinator. Simone had agreed to the overtime rate without negotiating it, which her attorney later said was the only time in 10 years of working with her she had seen Simone not negotiate something. The closing happened on a Saturday in October. All documents signed. All funds transferred. 234 South Wabash Avenue was, as of 9 a.m., the property of Achieve Capital LLC. At 9:15, her grandfather came around the corner. She watched him come. He was 80 years old, and he walked the way men walk when they have been physically disciplined their entire lives, and the discipline has held. Upright, deliberate, with the specific unhurried quality of someone who has never needed to perform urgency. He had his shoe shine kit in his left hand. He was dressed in the clothing he always dressed in for work. Clean, pressed, the particular standard of presentation that he had maintained since 1994 as a form of respect for the sidewalk and the street and the people who stopped at his chairs. He stopped when he saw Simone. He looked at her. He looked at the building. His eyes moved across the facade, the brick and the stone and the windows and the green awning he had stood under for 30 years, with the attention of someone looking at something very familiar from a different angle than usual. Then he looked at her again. He said, "Simone, what did you do?" She held up the key. It was a physical key, a copy made specifically for this moment. because the building had been rekeyed as part of the closing process, and she had asked the locksmith to make one copy before switching to the electronic system. And this was the copy. A simple brass key, the kind that opens a front door. She sighed, "Happy birthday, Grandpa. Come inside." He looked at the key. He looked at the door. He looked at her face. It took the key. They went inside together. Simone, James, her mother, her aunt, through the front door of 234 South Wabash Avenue, into the space that had been a bank branch for 30 years and was now, as of 9 a.m. that morning, hers. The space was empty, cleaned out, the teller windows gone and the carpet pulled and the walls bare, with the particular quality of a room that has been cleared of its previous purpose and is waiting for its next one. James stood in the middle of the floor and looked around. He turned slowly, taking in the ceiling and the windows and the walls and the bare concrete floor with the attention of someone looking at a space the way you look at something when you're not judging what it is, but imagining what it will be. Had spent 30 years looking at this building from outside. The outside view had been all he had. The inside was different, larger than it seemed from the sidewalk, lighter than he had imagined, with windows that caught the October morning at an angle that fell in long rectangles across the floor. He sighed nothing for a long time. His hands were at his sides. His kit was on the floor beside him. It was 80 years old, and he had been on his feet on the sidewalk outside this building for 30 of those years, and he was standing in its interior for the first time. On the weight of the two facts, the outside and the inside, separated by 3 decades and the decisions of systems, was in the room with all of them. Then he said, "What are you going to put here?" She told him, "A community financial center, credit union access, financial literacy programming, small business development resources, a space that served the people who had been walking past this building for 30 years from the outside and who had as much right to what was inside it as anyone who had ever had an account there." It was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have liked that." Simone said, "I know. I thought about that when I was putting it together." It nodded once. Then he put the key in his pocket. Then he went outside, to the sidewalk, and set up his 2 chairs under the green awning, because it was a Saturday morning and he had work to do. The community center opened 18 months later. The opening ceremony was on a Saturday. Simone had made a decision early in the planning process that this project would run on Saturday schedules wherever possible, because the people it was designed to serve worked during the week, and Saturday was when they could come. The ceremony was simple. Brief remarks from Simone, a prayer from James, coffee and food from 3 local businesses that had been operating in the neighborhood for over a decade. James Achebe gave the prayer the same way he gave the grace at family dinners, without preamble, without performance. In the steady, unhurried register of a man who has been talking to God for 60 years and has no need to announce the conversation. I thank God for the work, and for the people, and for the place, which he described as a place that had been waiting for a long time to be used correctly. It went back to his chairs after the prayer. He was 81 years old. He would work that spot for 2 more years before his knees required him to stop. And when he stopped, Simone had a chair. A proper chair, comfortable, positioned in the window of the community center where the afternoon light came in. That she had put there specifically so that he could sit and watch the street and talk to people if he wanted to, which he did, because that was what James Achebe did. He sat in the chair on a Tuesday afternoon in November and watched the people come into the building his granddaughter had bought with the same attention he had watched everything in his life, with the patient, unhurried regard of a man who understands that the world moves slowly and that the best way to see it move is to sit still. He had been sitting outside this building for 30 years. He was glad, he told his daughter one evening, to finally be inside it.